Today we are going to be looking at the Subjunctive II, or Konjunktiv II in German. There is a Subjunctive I as well. We are not going to look at it here. If you continue on with German in college, you'll probably study the Subjunctive I at that time. But the Subjunctive II is much more common in German. So what is subjunctive? Every verb in a German sentence has a tense and a mood. So a tense is present tense, past tense, future tense. And there are also three moods that a verb could have. It could be indicative, it could be imperative, or it could be subjunctive. Primarily what we've seen up to this point is indicative, and we've also learned a little bit of imperative as well. So indicative is saying something that is true. So for instance, ich bin hier, I am here. Kam gestern zur Schule? Did he come yesterday to school? Morgen wird es regnen. Tomorrow it will rain. Those are all statements of fact. It expresses a real situation, whether that's past tense, future tense, or present tense. Then we have imperative. So a verb is in the imperative mood when it is expressing an order. For instance, schreib einen Satz, write a sentence. Beschreib das Wort, describe the word. Besprich diese Fragen mit einem Partner. Discuss these questions with a partner. Then we get to subjunctive. So a verb is in the subjunctive mood when it expresses wishes, possibilities, or conditions that are contrary to fact. So if something is true, then it was indicative. If it's not true, then it's subjunctive. Here are some examples, and we'll look at this in more detail in a moment. Ich wünsche, dass ich gute Noten hätte. I wish that I had good notes, but I don't. Wenn ich nur da gewesen wäre, if only I had been there, but I wasn't. Wenn Superman hier wäre, würde uns helfen. If Superman were here, he would help us, but he's not here, so he can't help us. Just as a note, if you have learned another foreign language like French or Spanish, please note that the way that they use subjunctive is different to German. They don't have a whole lot in common. So the German Konjunktiv II, or Subjunctive II, is more similar to the conditional in those languages. Okay, so let's look at those examples in a little bit more detail. When exactly do you use the subjunctive? Here are some specific instances that are very common for the subjunctive to be used. The first is for if-then clauses. So we're going to use the conjunction wenn. We've learned wenn as whenever, but we also learned what it means if. In these kinds of statements, we're going to translate wenn as if. So, wenn ich Zeit hätte, würde ich lesen. If I had time, I would read. But I don't have time, so I'm not reading. Wenn du hier wärst, könnten wir anfangen. If you were here, we could begin. But you're not here, so we can't begin. Ich würde kommen, wenn du mich einladen würdest. I would come if you invited me, but you didn't because you're mean like that. Alright, those are examples of if-when clauses. Our next example set is for wishes. These often also start with wenn. So, wenn ich nur Russisch sprechen könnte, if only I could speak Russian. Wenn es nur regnen würde, if only it would rain. Ich wünschte, dass ich keine Hausaufgaben hätte. I wish I didn't have any homework. Okay, but I can't speak Russian. It's not raining because this is Texas, and I have lots of homework because this is high school. Then we get contrary to fact statements. This is a little bit broader of a category. Here's an example. Ich würde meine Hausaufgaben machen, aber es ist schon Mitternacht. I would do my homework, but it's already midnight, so I'm not doing it. Würde mitkommen, aber muss das Haus aufräumen. He would come with us, he would come along, but he has to clean the house. So in the first half of each of those sentences, we have a statement that is contrary to fact. Something would be the case, but it's not. The final instance is for polite requests. These are going to be more polite than if you're using the imperative mood, which, if you remember, was to give commands, like speak with a partner, write a sentence. So here we have, würden Sie mir bitte helfen? Would you please help me? Könnten Sie mir sagen, wo Alexanderplatz ist? Could you please tell me where Alexanderplatz is? Hätten Sie Zeit, mit mir zu sprechen? Might you have time to speak with me? Ich möchte eine Tasse Kaffee. I would like a cup of coffee. By the way, you've been seeing that verb möchten since I think German 1 or German 2 on occasion, and you didn't know this whole time that it was in subjunctive all the time. Look at that. Alright, so those are the instances in which you would use subjunctive. So let's look at how you put it together. You've already seen a number of examples, so I think you're getting familiar with the pattern. So, how do we form the subjunctive? Let's look at these examples. Ich würde die Museen in Berlin besuchen. Würdest du mir bitte helfen? Wenn nur kommen würde. If you'll notice in all of these sentences, we have a combination of würde and an infinitive. So let's look at these. We have würde in this first example. Ich würde die Museen in Berlin besuchen. Würde comes second, besuchen at the end, which does not surprise us because we know that that is usually where German verbs occur. And the second one, würdest, comes at the very beginning because in a yes-no question the verb always comes first, but then the infinitive is at the end. And in the third example, wenn nur kommen würde, wenn is a subordinating conjunction like das or weil, meaning it pushes the verbs to the end, and whichever one is conjugated is going to move to the very end. So this word order is following exactly what we would expect, and we see a form of würde and an infinitive. So how do we conjugate this? Well, würde here is actually a form of the verb werden in the subjunctive. So werden is our infinitive. If you note, this looks really similar to wurde, which is what we used when we were looking at passive voice. Die Tür wurde geöffnet. The door was opened. If we just add an umlaut to that, we get würde. Wurde, würde. Okay, so the subjunctive form of würde actually is created from the past tense form of werden. And we'll see that with some other verbs as well. But if you're going to conjugate würden, we have ich würde, du würdest, würde, wir würden, ihr würdet, sie würden. As I mentioned, this is formed from the past tense form of werden. If you remember when we look at praeteritum verbs, the ich and the er forms are always the same. So they have the same ending. And it follows that pattern here as well. The ich and the er forms both end with e. The er form does not end with a t the way it does in present tense. So just as a side note, to review our uses of werden, when it's used by itself, it means to become. When we have werden and an infinitive, that's future tense. Ich werde zum Markt gehen. I will go to the market. When we have wurde and a past participle, we get passive voice. When we have würde and an infinitive, then we have subjunctive mood. So werden is a very multi-purpose verb in German. We have to keep straight. What does it mean based on what it's used with? Okay, so as we saw in those examples, the most common way and the easiest way to form the subjunctive is to put a form of würden with an infinitive. And you can do this for pretty much any verb. Now, every verb does actually have its own special form of the subjunctive, but really if you just use würden with that verb, that's really all you need for these purposes, and that's really much more common than actually using the formal subjunctive form of each individual verb. I'll show you those just to give you an idea of what they look like. So kaufte means würde kaufen, would buy. Käme is würde kommen, would come. And ginge is würde gehen, would go. Like I said, you are not going to need to know those kinds of individual subjunctive forms. You can just use the würde plus infinitive construction. However, there are a few individual subjunctive forms that you should know and use because they are very common and they are not used with würde. This would be hätte, which is würde haben, would have. You would not say würde haben, you would say hätte. and wäre. This is würde sein or would be. You would not say würde sein, you would say wäre. If you remember, these are formed based on the past tense, the Präteritum forms of those verbs. So the Präteritum of haben is hatte. We added an umlaut to get hätte. The Präteritum of sein is war. We added an umlaut to get wäre. So our primary three subjunctive verbs that we're going to be using are würde, hätte, and wäre. As a note, modal verbs have their own forms as well. They look just like the past tense forms, although 4 of them keep their umlaut. So ich könnte gehen, wenn, I could go if. Ich müsste gehen, wenn, I would have to go if. Ich dürfte gehen, wenn, I would be allowed to go if. Ich möchte gehen, wenn, I would like to go if. Ich sollte gehen, wenn, I should go if. And ich wollte gehen, wenn, I would want to go if. Now, könnte, müsste, dürfte, and möchte all look different from their past tense forms, their Präteritum forms. It's könnte instead of konnte, müsste instead of musste. But sollte and wollte look exactly the same as their Präteritum forms. How will you know if it's in subjunctive? Context. Just has to do with context. You do not need to know all of these. There are just 2 that I want you to be familiar with because they're used more often. That is könnte and möchte. Ich könnte gehen, I could go. Ich möchte gehen, I would like to go. The other ones you do not need to know. Okay, now it's time for you to try it. I'm going to give you some exercises and then you can pause the video, go ahead and try them, and then play the video again to check your work. So, here's a couple examples. Fill in the blank with the correct subjunctive form of the verb in parentheses. So, in the example for number 1, you're going to turn haben into its subjunctive form. And number 2, you're going to turn sein into its subjunctive form. Go ahead and pause the video and do those right now. Ich wünschte, ich hätte Urlaub. I wish that I had vacation. Wenn wir nur reich wären, if only we were rich. We have haben changed to hätte and sein changed to wären. Okay, now try these. Rewrite these sentences in the subjunctive. Right now they're in the indicative. Ich esse jeden Tag Schnitzel and ich habe meine Hausaufgaben zu spät abgegeben. Go ahead and pause the video and do these 2. Okay, for this first one, we're going to use the würde plus infinitive construction. Ich würde jeden Tag Schnitzel essen. I would eat Schnitzel every day. And for number 2, we are going to use hätte, not würde haben. So ich hätte meine Hausaufgaben zu spät abgegeben. I would have turned in my homework too late. Okay, and complete each of these sentences with an appropriate ending. Any ending you want, as long as it makes sense. Wenn ich reich wäre, if I were rich. Wenn ich mehr Zeit hätte, if I had more time. Remember that wenn clause is going to act as the first element of your sentence, so you'll need your verb to come right after that. Go ahead and pause the video and finish these sentences. Here are some examples that I gave. Yours will look different, but they should be set up similarly. Wenn ich reich wäre, würde ich nur Teilzeit arbeiten. If I were rich, I would only work part-time. Wenn ich mehr Zeit hätte, würde ich öfter lesen. If I had more time, I would read more often. So, after the comma, you should have your verb in subjunctive, and then if you have another verb, an infinitive, it would be at the end. So just to review, subjunctive is a mood of a verb in German. It is used for if-then statements, for wishes, conditions that are contrary to fact, and for polite requests. And you form it using würde and the infinitive.